Thank you all for being here. Welcome. My name is Mary Olson, and I'm the founder of the Gender and Radiation Impact Project. I'm actually going to adjust my camera. Sorry, guys. So I have the honor of moderating this session, and we're focusing on radiation and radioactive pollution from both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. We may even go broader than that in our discussion. Radiation is an unseen factor in disease and death, but also unacknowledged and dismissed before basic evidence is examined. We're here to set the record straight. Radiation is a public health hazard and contributes to the major causes of death today in our country, including cancer, heart disease, and stroke. Infertility is another outcome. Further, this harm is not uniform. There is disproportionate harm to communities near nuclear industry sites, often disproportionately Black, Indigenous, people of color, low income, and non-English speaking. And you will hear today that female bodies are more harmed by radiation than male bodies. We have two speakers, and they will keep their presentations short, so we have plenty of time for your questions, and maybe some of mine too. So here's the housekeeping. We do not have an open chat today. We're using the Q&A function. If you're not familiar, it's one of the little buttons on your Zoom program. You can find it. And we encourage you to not hold back, put questions in the Q&A function at any time. I will then pose them to the speakers after both speakers have spoken. Yeah, most of our session will be in discussion. So our first speaker is Cindy Folkers, and I am pleased and proud that she's a colleague that I work closely with. She holds a Master of Science in Environmental Sciences. She is the Radiation and Health Hazard Specialist at the NGO Beyond Nuclear. Cindy has served communities harmed by radioactive pollution from nuclear industries for more than 2 decades. She has published articles in peer-reviewed journals on the history of radiological harm and its regulation. And she is co-author with Ian Fairley of the new book, The Scientists Who Alerted Us to the Dangers of Radiation. Finally, she co-authored the recent op-ed on concealing nuclear harms that was in The Hill several weeks ago. Her co-author is our second speaker, Dr. Amanda Nichols. Cindy.
Thank you so much, Mary. Hello to all, and thank you for attending this event. One of the original and most dangerous deceptions about nuclear technology pretends that radiation isn't harmful or that any health risks are small and easily managed. But scientists and experts who actually researched this had suspected early on in the nuclear age that radiation exposure was damaging, even down to the smallest exposures. But evidence of radiation's harms has been suppressed or ignored. Radiation is a carcinogen, a teratogen, and a mutagen. This slide shows where some common radionuclides released from nuclear power reactors travel in the pregnant body. Now, research shows that exposure to lower amounts of radiation, like that released from nuclear power reactors, is associated with childhood cancer. Childhood leukemias are elevated within 5 kilometers of a nuclear reactor, and an analysis of more than 7 million people found that living within 30 kilometers of a reactor increased cancer risks of various types, with children under 5 having the highest risk for all cancers. Research also shows that radiation from reactor meltdowns and catastrophic releases is associated with increases in thyroid cancer, perinatal mortality, and, despite what you might have heard, an association with transgenerational damage in humans. That is, the compounding harm caused to one generation is passed down to future generations. Radiation stays in the environment for generations as well, continually exposing people and animals, and the damage is cumulative. The problem is we don't figure this harm into our energy choices appropriately because we've been told not to worry about it. There are lots of ways to suppress research or ignore data on radiation harm. I co-authored a book about this with Dr. Ian Fairley. It's pictured here. It's newly out in paperback. It's got an e-version, and you can order it using the QR code on the slide. We highlighted blatant suppression, but there are also more subtle ways to suppress research findings, and I will highlight a few here, some of which are in our book, some of which are not. First is bad study design, where researchers assume before a study is performed that radiation exposures were too low to cause any diseases that might be spotted in that population. And then when they do find disease impacts, they can't attribute them to radiation exposure because they've already discounted it. And so what you're left with is a community that's suffering disease and no explanation as to why. Now, this false assumption has pervaded radiation research for decades, and in fact, a Nuclear Regulatory Commission study that was supposed to examine cancers around nuclear facilities in the United States, particularly childhood cancers, was canceled because NRC said they wouldn't find anything, and that from the NRC's perspective, the real reason to conduct the study would be to mollify public concerns. So really, this wouldn't have been much of a scientific study or research as it was propaganda to tell people they weren't experiencing what they were experiencing, and if they were, it wasn't due to radiation because the doses were too small. In attempts to revive the study through US health agencies, the same excuses were given not to conduct it, even though Congress would have funded it and the vehicle for study would not have been NRC, but would have been a health agency of the United States. There were also a history of pressure from various funders, and I'm going to highlight one case where there was a funder who was within the US government, and he basically told a researcher to go back home to get the right answer. Well, what was the wrong answer that the researcher found in his study? The data showed among a population of nuclear weapons workers that there were increases of disease. Apparently, that was the wrong answer for this US government funder. This was the same funder who also published a dozen studies by mixing government funding with industry funding under the umbrella of a pro-industry study organization. This person would then use these published studies against plaintiffs in courts of law, plaintiffs that were claiming damage from nuclear facilities. Of course, this is a huge conflict of interest, and in the end, his actions served to negatively warp radiation science, particularly on heritable damage. And this suppression continues. New reporting from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists shows researchers proved soon after the Fukushima meltdown in Japan that radioactive hot particles had contaminated the air in Tokyo, but their work was concealed from the public for many years. And we can see how Fukushima's radioactive fallout in Tokyo was concealed from the public. That is the title that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists gave this very important revelation. So nuclear for electricity generation has always been a lie, since it's too expensive to exist on its own, and it was actually established to be a cover for, among other things, producing and supplying plutonium for nuclear bombs during the post-World War II arms race. The nuclear lobby pretends that nuclear is a clean energy source when in fact it's extremely dirty, and that it is key to fighting climate change when in fact it makes climate change worse. Why? Because nuclear is more expensive than any other non-fossil source, as shown in the upper left-hand corner of this graphic here. And it takes decades to come online, if ever. In the meantime, fossil energy may very well fill the void that nuclear cannot. This historic suppression of nuclear technology's harms has shifted into high gear today, unfortunately, as the nuclear lobby and artificial intelligence companies push for new nuclear power for AI and data centers, even though renewable energy sources will come onto line quicker and cheaper. Media increasingly repeats industry talking points about the safety and benefits of nuclear power, even as the claims get bolder and more preposterous, and even as studies point more and more to concerns about widespread health harms of using nuclear technologies like nuclear power. Now, a lot of this positioning comes from disinformation. And so on January 28th, we see this revealed when the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock up a second to 89 seconds before midnight, the closest to nuclear annihilation we have ever been. They contended that growing nuclear dangers are greatly exacerbated by the potent threat multiplier of mis and disinformation. And this disinformation environment in itself significantly raises nuclear risks. And this is where proper communication and correct statements of fact can help us understand what a danger nuclear technologies pose to us and to our environment, and enable us to see clearly a better choice in renewable technologies like wind and solar. The media is instrumental in combating this disinformation. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll hand it back to Mary.
Thank you, Cindy. And I'm going to add just one little reflection on what Cindy just told us. The radioactive pollution is baked in with a nuclear power reactor or a nuclear weapons production facility. There's no such thing as operating those facilities without planned and permitted releases and leaks and, way short of a major accident, it's coming out of those sites day in, day out. It is why they have a license and it's considered permissible. So having added that one little perspective on Cindy's view, we're going to turn now to Amanda Nichols. She holds a PhD in environmental studies, and she is currently a research fellow in the environmental studies program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's also the managing editor of the peer-reviewed Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. She co-authored with Cindy the recent op-ed on concealing nuclear harms published by The Hill, and co-authored with me the new report from the United Nations Institute on Disarmament Research, a report entitled Gender and Ionizing Radiation Toward a New Agenda Addressing Disproportionate Harm. Amanda and I will present this new report at the upcoming third meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the UN in New York on March 5th. I'd like to have the slides go back to the previous. And Amanda, you can take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you all for being here today. I think we need to go back one more slide to start with, if that's possible. Thank you. So the connections between the renewed push for development of nuclear energy and the historic suppression of the harms of all nuclear technologies cannot be overstated. Arguments for increasing nuclear power and developing new nuclear energy technologies on the basis of the false advertising that nuclear is safe and clean, and especially that it has the potential to save us from the impending climate crisis, are not new. In fact, this rhetoric is strikingly similar to the pro-nuclear discourses from the 1940s and 50s that were used to promote the Manhattan Project and to sell the promise and potential of nuclear technology as what Jeremy Gunn called the spiritual weapon to attack atheistic communism. The salvific potential of nuclear technologies has been a long-standing trope in pro-nuclear political rhetoric and has long been used to justify the development and expansion of America's nuclear program. The harmful effects of nuclear technologies, however, are well documented. In 2006, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences published this report that you see here, entitled The Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation 7, or the BEER 7 report. This report presented 60 years of data from the lifespan study of atomic bomb survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. The Lifespan Study was a long-term research program that was instituted by the U.S. military in 1950 and followed approximately 120,000 atomic bomb survivors from both cities. The data reported from initial examinations, interviews, and follow-up surveys are summarized in the BEER 7 report. This dataset has enabled scientists and researchers to study and to better understand the relationships between exposure to ionizing radiation and various health consequences, including rates of cancer and death since the bombings when the study population suffered the initial pulse of radiation from the atomic bomb detonations. As Cindy noted, there are lots of ways to suppress research and ignore data. Despite the importance of the data that they do present, the LSS and the Beer 7 report do not discuss some of the key findings that I will present here today, and they also obscure several important points. Foremost, the LSS was focused on collecting data about one specific research question: the rate of harm from external exposure as a direct result of the gamma and neutron radiation from a nuclear detonation. Therefore, this research did not look at any of the internal exposures, which occur when radioactive materials are absorbed into the body through inhaling or ingesting them. In internal exposure, radioactive emissions continue from radionuclides that are inside the tissues and organs of the body. The LSS does not consider additional or compounding exposures that occurred in the aftermath of the detonation from fallout or at any subsequent life stage. Since many of the existing radiation protections today are based on the LSS, they also fail to consider radiation hazards from internal exposure. This continues to be a major omission in conversations about radiation protection standards. The LSS also began in 1950, 5 years after the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, so well after those who suffered the highest levels of radiation exposure and other injuries had already largely perished. The LSS data is therefore already skewed because it does not include data about the individuals who experienced the most acute doses of radiation exposure, those who died immediately or within the first hours, days, weeks, and years after the initial exposure. The LSS also tracked only survivors of the 1945 bombings, so it does not directly include impacts to pregnancies in 1945 or data about the impacts of exposure on subsequent generations. And finally, as far as the Beer 7 report is concerned, though it reports data on the differentiated health outcomes for males and females from external exposure to ionizing radiation, the report does not draw any conclusions about the sex-based differences in outcomes seen in this data. It simply reports the numbers, and though the evidence is there was no effort to highlight or draw attention to that data. In 2011, however, Mary Olson went to the data, to the Beer 7 report itself, and she crunched the numbers. The findings, which are documented in the bar chart here, were astounding. Olson published her findings in a Nuclear Information Resource Services report in 2011 entitled "Atomic Radiation is More Harmful to Women." What she found was that biological sex and age at time of exposure were independent factors in radiation harm. Over the course of their lifetimes, women exposed as adults suffered 50% more cancer death than did men in the same age group. For every 2 men in these cohorts who died of cancer, 3 women died of cancer. The data was even more staggering in the youngest age cohort. Little girls exposed between birth and 5 years old were twice as likely to get cancer at some point in the next 60 years than were boys. For every male in the birth to 5-year cohort that suffered cancer, 2 females got cancer. This is not childhood cancer. This is total incidence over the lifetime. Importantly, in addition to showing a difference between males and females, the data in the Beer 7 forces us to reevaluate the basic premise of radiation exposure as a consistent, universal, interchangeable, indiscriminate event. The finding that radiation impacts are not uniform and that age and sex are factors in the outcomes of a same level exposure have raised a variety of questions about the international standards for radiological protection. Formally established in 1974 by the International Commission on Radiological Protections, the reference man model has long been used as the standard for setting global radiation protection standards. Defined as a male between 20 to 30 years of age, weighing 70 kilograms or approximately 154 pounds, being approximately 170 centimeters or 5 foot 7 inches tall, and living in a climate with an average temperature between 10 and 20 degrees Celsius, reference man is a Caucasian or Western European or North American descent, and in habitat and custom. Mary has shown in her analysis of the BEER7 dataset that radiation regulation based on reference man results in systemic underreporting of radiation harm for the global population. Not only does it ignore the documented disproportionate harm to women and girls, but it also overlooks other distinctions such as race and geographical location that evidence has shown are also independent and compounding factors in radiation harm. The continued use of this model by the United States and nuclear regulatory bodies perpetuates the culture of suppression and omission of critical data about the harmful effects of radiation from nuclear technologies. Regulatory committees in the United States and around the world have and continue to ignore biological sex and age at exposure as factors in radiation harm. Given this critical and evidence need, we find that further failure on the part of international bodies of radiological protection to prioritize and engage these questions constitute what Steve Wing identified in 2010 as a continuing pattern of gender-based injustice characteristic of the entire history of nuclear impacts and technologies. Given the long and now well-documented history of lies, omission, silencing, and erasure that has happened in the nuclear industry, the continued failure on the part of regulatory bodies to take these findings seriously not only actively perpetuates, but also makes them complicit in ongoing nuclear-based harm and social and environmental injustice. Importantly, Olson's findings helped give the United Nations General Assembly the evidence that they needed to go into treaty negotiations for the new Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2015. Drafted under humanitarian law, the TPNW is rooted in universal human rights and is specifically concerned with the impact that indiscriminate weapons can have on non-combatants, including and especially women and children. On the 22nd of January 2021, the TPNW went into effect 90 days after it was ratified by the required 50th nation. It's the first legally binding international agreement to comprehensively prohibit nuclear weapons. This treaty makes it illegal in the eyes of the International Court of Justice at the UN for any nation to develop, test, produce, stockpile, trade, threaten to use, or use nuclear weapons. Today, 94 nation states have signed this treaty, and of those, 73 have ratified it. The United States is not one of them. In 2024, Mary and I were contracted by the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research to write this report on gender and ionizing radiation. The report shows that further evidence of disproportionate harm is well documented in radiation research published since 2006, and that biological sex and age at time of exposure are independent and compounding factors in the level of radiation harm. This research confirms and provides additional evidence that shows that women are more at risk of cancer and non-cancer related disease outcomes than are men in every age cohort, and that the difference is greatest in the lowest age cohort, children between the ages of 0 and 5 years. In closing today, I want to quote from editor John Mecklin what he wrote in the 2025 Doomsday Clock statement. Our fervent hope, he said, is that leaders will recognize the world's existential predicament and take bold action to reduce the threats posed by nuclear weapons, climate change, and the potential misuse of biological science and a variety of emerging technologies. The key point that I want to leave you with today is that despite the nuclear industry's efforts to cover up the risk that all nuclear technologies, including nuclear energy, pose to all life on Earth, and despite the blatant disregard of data, the efforts to suppress research and silence scientists, there remain many people committed to bringing these dangers to light. These individuals refuse to be silenced, and they continue to take bold action, not only to identify the truth about the harmful effects of nuclear technologies, but to make sure that they are widely known. And it is important to acknowledge that several such people are in this room with us today. One of those people is Mary Olson, and so today I want to raise up her work as an example of the type of bold action that is necessary if we are going to resist the ongoing social and environmental injustices enacted and justified by the nuclear industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Cindy, if you would join us also. Thank you. And I want to invite everyone to find the Q and A. It's a little letter Q ampersand A at your Zoom controls, and bring your questions, because we have a full half hour, if we stay together that long, to engage with what your thoughts, your questions are. The chat is not open, so you have to find the Q and A opportunity. And we have questions. Okay, here's the first one, and I'd like both of you to speak to this. If the results of your research were shown beyond doubt to be correct, and the new maximum allowable exposure standards would essentially force the closure of all commercial nuclear power plants. That's an assertion, actually, not a question, but you could treat it as a question. Is the ultimate goal of our research, is that the ultimate goal of our research? Have you considered a legal path to challenging the industry on such a basis? And how long might it be before such a challenge might be mounted?
So, all right, I'll begin with this question. The ultimate goal of our research, I feel, is to surface information and potential harms that have been subjugated or suppressed previously. Please understand that in the development of nuclear technologies, they began as a wartime technology in many respects, especially nuclear energy. It was never meant to actually be, as I said in my presentation, economically viable. And as such, it was a wartime technology, and so you run into questions of national security. And whenever you run into questions of national security, it sort of warps the questions that are asked and how they're asked and what answers are given. So for instance, in 1960, the idea of standard children was put forth by what is now part of EPA, what was then called the Federal Radiation Council. And the reason that they put forth an idea of standard children was because even in 1960 and before, they suspected that children might be more susceptible to radiation damage than adults. But the fact is, that is not how they pursued radiation protection or radiation exposure standards. It was not standard children. And so in a wartime footing, they didn't take into account the dangers that might happen to the entire population, or that an entire population might be exposed. They were looking mostly at male workers. They were looking mostly at lower population levels of workers and maybe the towns around them. And so what ended up happening was, as we moved off the wartime footing from the buildup with the World War II and nuclear weapons, they didn't really fully adjust the exposure standards to full populations. So what we have today is a residual in radiation protection that was not democratic, that was based on a wartime footing. And as such, it really isn't a question of what our goal is as far as, do we want to close this technology or do we not want nuclear reactors? If nuclear reactors are shown to cause childhood cancers, then they should not be able to do that, right? I mean, and these are questions that we never really brought up in a democratic society, that we never really fully adjudicated, right? And so as a result, we are stuck today with a bunch of information that shows that these reactors damage children, damage pregnancy, damage females more, but a bunch of exposure standards that do not account for any of that, right? In a way that is fully protective. And so what happens as a result of that is not my focus. What my focus is getting the information out so that people understand what the questions are that we need to ask and how we can protect ourselves.
Thank you, Cindy. Amanda?
Yeah, I'm going to be really brief because I think Cindy did a great job with that one. And I just want to echo what she said. I think the main point of our research is getting the information out and beginning to educate people. But I also want to say that we have a really long way to go before we get to the point of considering legal pathways to shut these things down, right? At present, we don't even have regulatory bodies widely recognizing that there is disproportionate harm or setting standards for radiological protections that are based on those that are most harmed. So the pathway to get between where we are now and where we are in the question that you're asking is a very long and arduous path that takes a lot of time and a lot of education and a lot of movement within global regulatory bodies and within the general public. So I think we have a long way to go before we start considering questions like that. So thank you for your question.
Can you talk more about what type of transgenerational effects result from radiation exposures? And the person asking is specifically interested in impacts of nuclear power plants.
Mary, I almost think that's a you question. I can take a stab at it, but I think that would be a good question for you to talk about as well if you want to jump in. There are a lot of different questions that we have regarding transgenerational impacts, and one of the things that I continue to say is that we don't yet fully know the scope of what the transgenerational effects are because this stuff hasn't been around long enough for us to have good data and good evidence on the long-term multi-generational evolutionary trajectories and how they affect humans specifically, but also non-human organisms over the course of multiple lifetimes. We do know that there are heritable impacts and that radiation harm can be passed down from generation to generation, and that it can come up or be exposed at any point in the course of the lifetime for the first generation or the second generation or the third generation. So specifics is something that I will look to Mary for to give you more specific details, but that's what we know now.
Cindy, do you want to chime in?
I'll just say one thing, that there was work that was done in the Bryansk region of Russia by a gentleman last name of Korsakov that looked at this issue, and they found de novo mutations in a population that had not had them before. Now, this was not the result of routine reactor radiation releases. This was the result of catastrophic releases. But there were birth defects that were associated with living in this kind of area. And the trajectory was that there were going to be, over the 18 or so years projected into the future, more birth defects. In other words, the trajectory of birth defects was increasing at the time that this person published this study, and I think it was in 2021. So that is a bit of a different scenario because they are living in areas that have been contaminated versus from a catastrophic release, and so the isotopes are different than what is normally released at nuclear power reactors. But radiation is a mutagen, and the ICRP, last time I looked, really didn't consider genetic impact past the second generation because what they claimed was it was too difficult to do so. So there are a lot of open questions.
I will add one point. This is something we could do a whole webinar on, and we should. But the one point is look up the 1958 paper. It's still online under the BMJ, British Medical Journal, by Dr. Alice Stewart, which is the origin of stopping using X-rays to monitor pregnancy, which they were all about. And today, sonograms are used, or basic old-fashioned listening to the fetus. But at one time, nearly all the women in Great Britain were being X-rayed if they were pregnant and getting care. And it was resulting in a massive outbreak of childhood leukemia. And Dr. Alice Stewart is the one who identified that it was the radiation, the X-rays of the mothers. So that's like the big clarion call for next generation impacts. And then today we have news reports recently, last few weeks, about cancers coming uh, to younger people in our society and more women than previously. Now, these are cancers from all sources. This is a leap of association. I'm not saying they're talking about only radiation there, but the fact that it is hitting people younger is what we would expect to see as a second generation outcome where the parents were exposed, and now the next generation is showing outcomes that could be radiation at a younger age. So we'll leave it there. And we have a good number of questions, but don't let that stop you. If you have a question, please do put it in the Q&A. So how did those of us with expertise in this work convince the physicists that what they know and were taught is clearly whitewashed by industry and government interest? This seems like a worthwhile endeavor for science activism. However, how do we push to get traction on addressing the very clear and intentional disinformation Cindy, Mary, and Amanda pointed out? And I'm going to toss this to you, Amanda, so you can hawk our report, and then to you, Cindy, so you can hawk your book. Because this is part of why we're doing this event today, is to be sure people know about these great resources. Amanda.
Sure. I think one of this is a very difficult question, right? Because there's no one clear, coherent, direct answer to this. I think sharing the research that we have, widely distributing the gender and ionizing radiation report that I have here, and widely distributing Cindy and Ian's book is a great way to start. But I also want to say that meeting people where they are is often a great way to start a conversation. So, what are the physicists talking about that we can kind of tap into and educate them about what is being whitewashed in their particular understanding of things? So I'm an academic, I'm an educator. So this is where I usually start, is where can I meet them where they're already at and start a conversation that leads them in the direction that we want them to go, which is to have a deeper understanding of the issues and the impacts, and especially the disproportionate impacts of radiation harm, and also the ways that these things have been covered up for generations now. So I'll stop there and let Cindy jump in.
So I'm going to kind of take a bit of a different tack, because my mantra these days is center the biology, center the human, don't center the physics. And so the reason that I say that is because as I look at the language of how nuclear technology unfolded, the language of exposure started with a tolerance dose. How much radiation could we tolerate? This was in the 40s or even earlier. And then when they found out that we couldn't actually tolerate anything, that there might be doses that even at small exposure levels would still be impactful to the human being, they decided to make it a permissible or a practicable dose. And when they shifted the language like that, they moved from centering how humans were harmed to centering how much we could be exposed to so that the industry would be allowed to proceed. right? And so what our book does that I co-authored with Ian Fairley is it looks at the trajectory of how the concerns about exposing more people, having nuclear radiation all over the place from above ground bomb tests, from deploying nuclear civilian reactors everywhere. It looks at the warnings that were ignored, basically, from a number of scientists, right? There are over 30 scientists in this book. Some are modern, some are from the beginning of radiation concern. And so it's really important, I think, to refocus the language, refocus our thoughts, not to what the industry needs to continue, but to refocus what we need as human beings and as people who care about animals, what we need to focus on to preserve our health. And you can do that in language, and you can do that. And as a prime example, think of the word half-life. Well, they use half-life, but when you think about how a radionuclide damages a human body, the half-life only is to the point where half of the radionuclide has disintegrated. Suppose and gone down to stable levels where it doesn't pose a danger anymore, but you still have half of it left. So for biological consequences, half-life means nothing. It's hazardous life. How long can this thing stay hazardous? And can we be exposed to it and be damaged? And so just changing the language will change the way that we think about how we have to evaluate how this technology is harming us.
Thank you, Cindy. I have a question here that I'm going to myself address briefly, asking about studies that have been done based on continental ancestry of women, African, Asian, Oceania, European, and American descent. Have these been studied and compared? And the answer is no. No such study exists that I am aware of, and I look often for this type of work in the literature. However, part of why we're doing this event, part of why we wrote the paper and the book, is the call for younger people, people who already have standing in research institutions, to take up these questions, for younger people to get their PhDs and MDs asking and answering these very important questions. My work poses more questions than it answers. For instance, we have no idea why female bodies are affected more than male bodies, and no one, as far as I'm aware of, has tackled that question. It's an important question, as is this one. But we're going to move on to the banana. Cindy, do you feel like debunking the industry PR about radioactive bananas?
Yes. So we all need potassium to function. It is an element that is critical for our existence. And it just so happens that a very, very, very minuscule amount of potassium in nature happens to be radioactive. I think it's like 0.012% or something, teeny, teeny, teeny. And here's the thing about potassium. In general, you get up to a level of potassium in your body and you don't exceed that level, right? So your potassium in your body exists at a homeostatic state, what they call a homeostatic state. So you can never get over a certain level of potassium in your body, naturally occurring potassium. Therefore, you can never have over a certain level of radioactive potassium. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here, and what comes from nuclear technologies, is adding to that radioactive burden that already exists in nature and that, yes, can impact your health. So natural radiation is not safe. There are a certain number of cancers that exist without anthropogenic radiation just naturally, right? So before the nuclear age, people died of cancer. The thing is that when you add the anthropogenic radiation that comes out of the reactors from catastrophic releases or from routine releases, you are adding to that natural radiation burden, which was already having health impact. So I don't know if that helps. I don't know if that clarifies, but that's the radioactive banana potassium thing. It literally is comparing sort of apples to lampshades. Like it's not the same. It's not this. It's not the way we need to think about um, radiation, because what we're focused on is additional radiation, additional to what is called natural background.
Thank you. Um, there's a question of the best sites to find research on ionizing radiation and related toxic impacts to women and children. And I'll just briefly say the Gender and Radiation Impact Project website is going to be included in all of these will be included in a follow-up email that participants will receive, probably not till Monday, but you'll be getting all these links. But genderandradiation.org is Gender and Radiation Impact Project website. Beyondnuclear.org is Cindy's website. She has a lot of information there. And I'm so pleased that our colleagues at Union of Concerned Scientists, excuse me, are originating some new, what they call explainers on radiation. So look up at ucsusa.org for that library. And our paper, Amanda and my paper, is posted on the Unidir website, which will also be included in the email, or you can find it linked off of the Gender and Radiation .org. Do you guys want to add anything quickly? Okay, moving on. Here's a question. I heard nothing about impacts of atmospheric tests like Nevada Test Site and Trinity. Would either of you like to speak to atmospheric testing?
I'll take a short stab at this question. I think that wasn't the primary focus of this particular webinar, so we didn't speak directly to it, but I just want to reinforce that the risk of harm from ionizing radiation from any sort of nuclear technology, including any nuclear testing, all of the nuclear testing that has been done around the world, has similar impacts, right? It's all has the risk of doing harm and doing disproportionate harm to women and girls as well. Mary has done great work on this with a team of people. There's a great mapping project led by Sebastian Philippe at Princeton that shows especially the nuclear fallout from atmospheric testing done in the United States. And so that's a great place to look for information like that. I'm sorry we didn't have time to cover it all in this particular webinar, but there's great research out there about that as well.
Here's a question. Explain why there's a difference based on biological sex. And I will take that one. We don't know why. We need a generation of people to step up and ask that question and a lot of others that go with it. I will simply mention that I had a conversation with a field ecologist about this. Could we look at non-human species, especially shorter lifespan, to start asking and answering? And he said he'd have to have 10 times more money because he'd have to stay in the field 10 times longer to differentiate male and female plants and birds and bugs and all the things he studies. So there are barriers to addressing this, but they women hold up half the sky. We need to honor this question and to answer it. Anyone else want to dive in on that? Okay. I'm going to come back to this one. Okay. There's been two questions, Cindy, for you to repeat the part about increased risks of cancer associated with nuclear power reactors and the distances from those reactors. Could you review that again?
Sure. Do they want the studies that I referenced there, by the way, will be in this list that we send people out after this webinar, probably not before Monday, but there will be references there that give these data. So childhood leukemias are elevated within 5 kilometers of nuclear reactors. That was work that it was an analysis, a meta-analysis done by Ian Fairley, but what he did was he was relying on the German KIC study, which I can give reference to, the French GeoCap study, which I can give reference to, and there were probably 2 or 3 other studies. There were, I think, at least 5 studies that had this issue that showed that there were elevated rates of childhood leukemias 5 kilometers out. And he had a theory as to why that was, and that theory was regarding tritium, the tritium off-gassing from these reactors, releases from these reactors, and the tritium crossing the placental barrier, so that these childhood leukemias would have actually been caused in childhood by exposure during pregnancy. So we can get you that study, and references to all of those studies are in that one study. Then this other study of 7 million people was actually June or July of last year, 2024, and that was 30 kilometers out. And so what they did was they looked at a whole bunch of, this was occupational and it was environmental exposures. So it was public and it was workers. And there were various types of cancer risks increased 30 kilometers out. And children under 5 were having the highest risk for all cancers, which is true, and what we would expect, right, to see elevated cancer risks among children. And I will note here that if the NRC had done this study around the 7 pilot sites in the United States as they had proposed, they were looking also 30 kilometers out from nuclear sites. At least that was the plan. Of course, they didn't do it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but we'll be giving references for all of this.
As we're coming down to the final closing of the session, I want to acknowledge that there's terrific questions, and to the extent possible, we will include those questions and at least some beginning of an answer in a linked piece to the email. In other words, you'll get a chance to see written replies to some of these great questions. But I want to take up briefly the question of these data centers, because it keeps coming up in the line of questions we're receiving, and it's a topical thing. So from my perspective, and I'm going to take this and then we'll have final opportunity for each of you to say something to close. A data center, whether it's for AI or for cryptocurrency or for anything else, is just a big customer for electric power. And the fact that our society is going that route is really an unfortunate piece of timing. However, because we're trying to reduce the amount of all types of energy consumed by our society, right? So this development of these really energy hungry facilities is bad timing. However, for climate, the answer will never be nuclear. And the reason it will never be nuclear is because nuclear, Cindy presented the data, is anywhere from 2 times to 4 times more expensive than wind and solar efficiency and storage. That's a little suite of things that when you deploy them together, they can support the entire state of California now for hours at a time. Pure renewable energy and storage is doing that in California. So it can support a data center. And we need to emphasize that the electricity that a data center consumes is just plain electrons flowing through wires. It's not special. And what comes out of a nuclear power plant is also not special. It's just electrons flowing through wires, same as a solar panel, same as a windmill. However, what also comes out of a nuclear reactor is the radioactivity, the pollution, the emissions to air that are permitted, the emissions to water that are permitted, the accidental additional releases, and then all the waste that we still don't know what to do with, including the most concentrated non-natural human generated waste, which is the fuel rods from these reactors. That's the largest reservoir of human-made radioactivity is in the fuel rods from any reactor. So we still don't know what to do with it. We don't know how to contain it. We don't know where to keep it for the very long term. So we're just upping these incredibly harmful, horrific health outcomes. We are dismissing public health to even consider the idea that an data center requires nuclear. It simply does not. It simply requires a whole lot of energy. And the solar and the wind do not have radioactive pollution associated with them. They have some public health issues, but very, very, very minor compared to dealing with a growing pile of irradiated fuel rods. So having said that, we now turn to our speakers to take us out with each of them a thought about what could be hopeful. What could we get if people didn't suppress this information? Cindy?
Sure, I'll go first. Oh, we could get a lot of things. I mean, from a scientific perspective, we could already have a more clear understanding of why it looks like women are more harmed by radiation than men. We could get which clearly we don't understand the mechanisms for that. It could be estrogen, it could be stem cells. I mean, there could be a whole lot of reasons and we just don't know. And there could be others that we haven't thought of. We could therefore better protect half or more than half of the population, if you're looking at it as a population question. But we could also be clearer on the cause of diseases that we currently see today, which seem to be increasing every time we turn around. And it's not just cancer, it's a lot of other weird diseases that are generally considered rare and that have been increasing. And so it's just without proper understanding, we are blinded, but that means that we need to get proper understanding and we need to fund the research that's going to help with that so that we can better protect ourselves and make better future energy choices.
The climate needs us to do that. Amanda.
Thank you, Mary. This is such a great question. I think we could get so much from this, right? We could get more equitable standards for protection. We could get better public health standards around the world. And we can also get a deeper understanding of the life cycle impacts, the transgenerational impacts, the biological and evolutionary impacts for the health of not only humans, but for all species and life on this planet. And I think those things are so necessary. So I just want to end on that. Like, that would be the hope, I think.
Thank you both. Thank you to everyone who participated today. We appreciate your questions. They're great questions, and you'll be hearing more from us soon. Thank you for joining us.